Good afternoon. Welcome to the Eagle Appropriations Subcommittee. Good to see so many faces here, and thank you for making the time today. We have a very robust agenda with a lot of speakers. So we'll be hearing from the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. We'll be hearing from our friends at the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments, from the Natural Resources Defense Council, and Safe Water Engineering about water infrastructure financing. Really important topic, close to our hearts as Michiganders, making sure that clean and affordable drinking water is available to all. I am again, happy to have you here and would ask the clerk to take attendance.
Chair Hood.
Present.
Representative McKinney.
Here.
Representative Braybeck.
Here.
Representative Weiss.
Here.
Representative Martis.
Here.
Representative Beeson.
Here.
Representative Cavett. Representative Schutte.
Here.
Madam Chair, there are 7 members present. The quorum of the subcommittee is present.
And we will move to approve the minutes of the February 19th meeting. We'll take a motion from Representative Weiss to move the minutes. And without objection, those will be moved, so ordered. With that, would folks from Eagle join us? We have Travis Polkschool, our Deputy Director, and Paul McDonald, our Finance Division Director.
Good afternoon. The chair mentioned the robust agenda, and we have a bit of a robust presentation, so I'm going to try to move a little quickly, noting the agenda and knowing what time y'all's session starts today. Travis Boskel, Deputy Director with the department, and Paul McDonald is our Finance Division Director, Chief Financial Officer, and a lot of our water infrastructure funding and financing and working with communities falls under Paul's purview. Really excited to be here in front of the committee today talking about this topic. Obviously, with the partnership of the legislature and the funding you've all allocated to us over the past few years, there's been a ton that we've been able to do in this space. You'll see a little bit about how maybe that's just like keeping us up for right now, and this presentation will show you in some ways what things look like as some of this one-time and time-limited money that we have and that you all have allocated, what it looks like as that starts to fall off. And I think it's important for you to understand. When I was in the liaison role, and even right now, questions from you all about funding and financing for water infrastructure projects in your communities, whether it's lead service lines, it's combined sewers, they are frequently just the most common questions that are coming in. So let's dive into it. All right, so overall mission of Eagle, right? We are here to protect Michigan's environment and public health by managing our air, water, land, and energy resources. And that's reflected in the vision of what we do with water infrastructure funding and financing. Protect public health and the environment, but we're trying to do it in a way that keeps that infrastructure maintained and in good condition, while reducing the burdens that your communities, your ratepayers, your constituents have to pay to keep that up. So just a little bit about what the water infrastructure need is. It comes back to that piece of protecting public health and the environment. This infrastructure is so important in that, whether it's wastewater treatment plants and wastewater systems to protect lakes and streams because people want to recreate in them. They want to canoe, they want to kayak, they want to fish, they want to swim in those. Or the expectation, the really reasonable expectation that every citizen has in this state, which is that the drinking water coming into their home is safe and it's coming through a pipe that doesn't have lead. And all of that is within the framing of trying to do that in an affordable way. So a little bit about kind of the backdated need. And I'm not going to spend a whole heck of a lot of time on this, but there are a ton of numbers. You can search on Google, you can look up old reports, there's been a lot of ink used to talk about what Michigan's water infrastructure need is, whether it was the 2016 21st Century Infrastructure Report that pegged that annual gap at $800 million, or the American Society for Civil Engineers in their kind of every 2-year report that grades Michigan's infrastructure, that in 2023, we had some of our grades go up in drinking water and wastewater and stormwater, but you can still see, right, D-, C+, they aren't really good scores in those categories. And in a lot of ways, one of the reasons those grades went up is because of the recent funding we've put into water infrastructure, but A, the decades of deferred maintenance in those systems, and then B, a recognition that the investment that Michigan has made over the past 3-4 years or so has been either one-time or time-limited, whether it would basically with those federal resources. So the takeaway from this slide is there's a lot of need. Numbers differ, but it's really clear what that need exists. Okay, so a little bit about table setting in terms of the state's role. And really, I think there's differing thought processes within the department, within the legislature, within the state about what the state's role is. But it's important to remember it's a piece of the pie of how these projects move forward. So I'll start, Paul will talk a lot today about, in particular, the state revolving fund, which is really our biggest, kind of longest standing way of funding and financing water infrastructure projects. But he'll talk about how we've used that as a tool to pull a lot of these pots together. In recent years, that federal funds piece of the pie has really been pulling a heck of a lot of weight. You'll see a little bit in the coming slides about the ARP dollars that the legislature took our state kind of discretionary federal COVID relief dollars and put that into water infrastructure as a one-time investment. You'll also see the benefit that we've experienced from the bipartisan infrastructure law at the federal level and the additional funding that has flowed into the state revolving fund for these types of projects. There's still 2 other pieces there, right? The local bonds and water rates. That's in a lot of ways, that's traditionally what kind of municipalities have been left to do when the state revolving fund didn't have a lot of money. We didn't have these federal dollars, and that's where we've seen a lot of that disinvestment. It's obviously painful, and municipalities are reluctant to raise those rates and continue making some of this work more unaffordable. And private financing is always an option too, but we know that's pretty unattractive compared to bonding, compared to coming into the state, and some of the terms that we can offer on our financing. One last piece I want to mention is the state's program plays a bit of a convening role for a lot of this too, right? So whether we're bringing in those federal dollars that I talked about, or we're coordinating with USDA Rural Development to figure out what portion of a project they can fund and how we can complement that to get the entire community's need met, we're trying to act as that convener for communities to help them find solutions. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Paul, and he's going to talk a little bit more in depth about some of the specifics of these programs.
Thanks, Travis. And so as Travis mentioned, EGLE's primary program for providing financing and funding to locals for water infrastructure is the SRF. And for many, many years, decades, if you will, both the drinking water and the clean water state revolving funds have been around to provide that assistance. And relatively, up until recently, specifically the summer of 2022, the way that those programs function had remained the same. But with the legislature's help, we passed PA 132 in the summer of 2022 that removed a significant amount of hurdles for communities, changed the way that we can score, the way that we define disadvantaged, and some other burdens that communities had experienced for many, many years. And I'll talk about those in a little bit more in detail in a couple of slides, but just to give you a preview into some of those impacts. Prior to that legislative change, A lead service line replacement project coming into a community would have scored the lowest priority on that list had that legislation not changed and we had worked with communities to change that scoring mechanism. The other thing before I want to move off the slide, and Travis had spoken about it a little bit, is the primary funding source for both programs in the SRF are capitalization grants that come from the feds, specifically EPA. They've been there since the beginning. They continue in and year out. However, there's been a pretty big negative impact to the state of Michigan's SRF program as it relates to congressional earmarks and the decision to use the funding that would normally come to states to fund those earmarks. And so as you can see, the most recent capitalization grants that we received was right around $43 million for both programs. To give perspective on how much that's changed in the last 2 or 3 years, the funding in 2022 combined was $66 million. In 2021 and 2020, it was $95.5 million each year. So it's decreased by more than half. And those are going specifically, to communities and projects. And while great for the state of Michigan, may not have been prioritized the same way had it come in through the SRF program. And I know that we've been before you, and as Travis said, we'll try to speed up based on the number of presenters today. So I won't go into a lot of detail on the different types of programs that can be funded through both drinking water and clean water, but I wanted to highlight another aspect and something that ties into our 2025 budget request. So with that PA 132 that passed in the summer of '22, Michigan realigned its ability to offer up funding for stormwater management, something that had always been possible through the EPA's program, but state legislation up until that point had prevented most of that activity. And so that now allows communities to be able to take action towards events, climate action, climate changes, right, that are affecting their stormwater management. The one thing that we've seen and how it ties into our budget, which Travis will go over in a little bit more detail, is there's not a funding source to pay back those loans, so communities are a little reluctant. So that budgetary request will pair between the SRF and trying to encourage communities to take action and provide them opportunities. And again, I'll highlight how the SRF works real briefly in the interest of time. Something else that we changed 3 or 4 years ago is this idea of an intent to apply. It's a very short form that communities engage with us early on in November. And it really, when I say short form, 2 to 3 pages. Provides some contact information. What is the community looking to do? How much do they think it'll cost? And when will it happen? The important part of that is once that form comes in, project managers on my team are paired up with engineers in either the water resource or drinking water divisions, and we engage with the communities to figure out what's on their project, what can we do to help. Travis had also mentioned, are there other opportunities that we can pair with it? Is there a USDA rural and development collaboration that can occur to really provide the best funding option for those communities? We work through many, many meetings up until the time that the communities actually submit their planning documents for us to look at, review, score, prioritize. And then in late August, early September, we put out a preliminary draft of those prioritized projects, and then starting from top to bottom, assigning that funding to those projects in priority order. It's at that time communities can then follow up, ask any questions they have. We hold a public hearing, take in advocacy group questions, citizen questions, take all of that, adjust the plan if we need to, and then finalize prior to October 1st. That's when a lot of the real work begins, where communities finalize permits, finalize their construction bids, and then sign off on the loan agreement that then opens the door for construction to begin. But I wanted to come back and talk about some of the things with your help, obviously, that we've been able to do in the last couple of years to change the SRF, again, reduce those barriers to make it more open to communities and understanding and being more transparent. And so wanted to touch a little bit on PA 132, again, and some of the things that occurred. Probably the most significant and a cost reducer for communities is changing what needs to be submitted to the department. Previously, it had to be a brand-new project document from beginning to end. Now we articulate those things that we need to be able to see to evaluate a project to see if it qualifies underneath EPA standards, but they can pull parts and pieces from different materials they currently have and submit it what we refer to as planning documents. So it doesn't have to be recreated, pull parts and pieces from it. As long as it answers the questions that are within the legislation on our website, we'll work with it. And then probably the other two that are pretty significant for communities is pulling out the definitions from the legislation and allowing the department to work with communities and advocacy groups to develop both the definition for disadvantage, which we now refer to as overburden and significantly overburden. There's actually a tiering system in there, as well as the scoring. Both of those areas where we worked with in a public forum with communities, with advocates, with just general residents expressing their concerns and trying to tie in and make the SRF meet what communities are looking for. In the end, the program is there to assist them through their water infrastructure needs, and so trying to closely tie that. The legislation that was passed indicates that we can't change either one of those any sooner than every 3 years. But in another year and a half, we'll revisit, open up the forum, take questions, concerns, and see if there is an opportunity to improve it even further. And last but not least, probably one of the more important item in there in the legislation is allowed the department to create tiered interest rates. And hopefully in talking to your communities, I know EPA was recently here doing a review on our project, and they informed us that our blended rates were the lowest of any Region 5 state currently. And I can tell you that our interest rates right now are the lowest that they've been in the last 15 years for the program. So another thing that, hopefully, excuse me, provides that opportunity to reduce a barrier and to bring communities in to seek that funding and financing that they need. But it's not just the legislation. We're also working on being much more transparent with those changes to the scoring and the definition of overburden and significantly overburden. Not only are all of our scoring sheets, the methodologies, the definitions posted on our website, but also the webinars that we held with the public and the questions they asked and how we followed out so they could see the changes in those documents. Talking about those public forums, holding webinars every year with communities to walk through how does scoring work? How does the definition of overburden affect me? How does that scoring sheet, what can I expect before they invest too much time into the process? All of that, those webinars, those info sessions, all there for them to revisit at their earliest convenience. And then lastly, before turn back to Travis, he had talked about the big impact that we've had in the last couple of years in the SRF. And so I wanted to talk about a couple of different funding mechanisms that we've associated with the SRF process and used to help communities, again, achieve those infrastructure needs. The very first one we've talked about a couple of times, it's the annual capitalization rate or annual capitalization grant that comes into the SRF. That is an ongoing EPA grant for both DWSRF and CWSRF. You can see by the much larger numbers on the next line, the bipartisan infrastructure law. It was a bill that was passed providing 5 years of continual funding. The numbers you see there are the 2024 values, and that is year 3 of bill. The law did not expand the SRF. It simply added more funding to existing capabilities while also earmarking some of those to a specific type of service. One of those happens to be emerging contaminants, but probably more familiar with the conversation that we're having. A significant portion of that is for lead service line replacement activity. So it can only be provided to those projects coming in seeking that type of infrastructure change. And while the bipartisan infrastructure law, again, those numbers just being the 1-year allocation for the SRF are pretty significant, it was through the action of this legislature that redirected or directed some of the ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act funding, to the SRF to be used in collaboration with loan dollars. So providing additional funding communities, but this time through grants, lessening the burden or the repayment for those communities. And you can see here that was one-time funding, but pretty significant in nature.
All right, so I'm going to kind of move past this slide pretty quickly, but just suffice it to, because I want to want you to keep in mind some of the things Paul just said on that last slide. But just suffice it to say that with 230 projects funded in the last couple of years, it's pretty easy to find a project in each of your districts where there's been a direct benefit as we've been allocating out this money. Okay, so coming to the slide that shows what demand has looked like before we dive a little bit into what we've funded. You can see, obviously that 2018 cycle with only $150 million in cumulative asks, that's the low point, and that feels like a different world now. Between what we've done internally in the program to make it more attractive for communities to come in with our interest rates, with that intent to apply process, but also some of the things that legislation did to make it more attractive for communities. The project plan to lower the cost so that we didn't have communities having to spend $50,000 just to get an application into us, trying to lower that obstacle so they can at least start having a conversation with our folks. As you can see, we've got 2024 where we really hit that high of over $5 billion in asks. And you'll see in the next couple slides here what we've been able to fund through that. But we haven't even seen a very significant drop off this year. Now, $1.5 billion is a lot less in asks, I can acknowledge that. But at the same time, $3.5 billion in projects coming in, that wouldn't have even been fathomable in 2020. It's not something this program has really historically been set up for. Okay, so let's go so you can see a little bit. We're going to go by clean water first. So this is your wastewater projects, a little bit of stormwater management. We'll do drinking water next, and then we have a breakout for lead service lines. So those tall single bars are the community requests on the clean water side. And then the composite column are those are what we funded or offered in funding financing to communities. So you can, first you can just see the gap right there right away, both in 23 and 24. But I think what's really important to focus in on are the two blue sections of that composite column. Those are the federal dollars. So that light blue chunk, those are the ARP dollars that we showed you, the $1 billion and the $78 million. Those are all allocated out. You all gave those to us in PA 53 back in 2022, and then you gave them to us in a supplemental along with last year's budget. We have offered all that out to communities. Either in 23, they're already in grants, or in 24, we're in the process of closing those loan and grant agreements on schedules that we sent with the community. So all the ARP dollars, we can't touch those anymore. We're not going to have those in this next cycle to subsidize some of those projects for communities. That darker blue bar, that's the bipartisan infrastructure law funding. So those are, again, 51% loan, 49% principal forgiveness or grant for the purposes of this group. Paul's probably cringing with me using that term, but I think that helps it understand a little better. He mentioned we're in year 3 in 24 of those dollars. That means after this we have 2 more years coming of the bipartisan infrastructure law. So what we did with FY25 is we took the community requests that are already in, because again, we had communities starting to submit those forms back in November, or I should say finishing submitting those forms in November, and we've started working with them. And then we took the bipartisan infrastructure law money that we know we're getting, and then our projection of how much we'll be able to offer in financing and funding through the state revolving fund. And as you can see, you've got close to $1.5 billion gap there, just in, again, it's hard for me to talk about what the overall need is in the state, but what I can tell you is projects that communities are ready to move forward on, that's the gap that we're looking at. They've come in, they said, we're ready to move forward on this, we're ready for permitting, we're engaged with an engineer. Okay, so let's move to drinking water next so you can see what that looks like. And I think it's even a little bit more stark here. In particular, and we'll go to lead service lines next, but you can see we're talking $250 million maybe in funding between the SRF and the bipartisan infrastructure law dollars, and close to $1.75 billion in requests. In requests. One thing I want to call out here is that green bar on each of these, you can tell it's a lot smaller than the clean water bar. On the drinking water side is smaller. And that's because the drinking water fund has been around a decade less. It's a less mature fund. So, with the revolving aspect of things, this money is always coming back to the state, or at least a portion of it is. But also the capitalization grant that we get from EPA is much smaller on the drinking water side than it is on the clean water side. Again, because of that maturity, but also those clean water projects can get really, really expensive. And so that's where federally they put a lot of priority in. We've also, Paul mentioned the congressional earmarks that are impacting our state program. We've also seen that impact more drastic on the drinking water side than on the clean water side. And again, that's because your counterparts at the congressional level, they're hearing the same things that you all are, right? We need help. We need help with lead service lines. We need help with keeping our communities' water safe. And they're going after that funding. Okay, so lead service line. In this case, we've got, there's a specific allocation in that federal bipartisan infrastructure law dollars that have been coming to Michigan that is just for lead service lines. And that's been about $75 million a year. Again, that's kind of the half grant, half loan that I was talking about earlier. We don't actually have our numbers for this upcoming year yet from EPA. They're doing a little bit of a recalculation, so we'll see what that does for Michigan. It's possible we could go up, possible we could go down, possible we could stay the same. So I can't really give you a projection of how much we have. But, even if you take $75 million of funding, and then even if you add the full drinking water state revolving fund loan line that you saw in the last, it puts us way, way short of that. I just wanted to take a moment to talk a little bit about what we know right now in the lead service line world, because I think it's useful for the committee to hear that. So our latest numbers are just over 300,000 lines that are known or very likely lead, and then another 300,000 lines that are unknown material. Historically, we've seen about 30% of those come back as lead. So it's 100,000 added to the 300,000. That gets you the current estimated universe of lead service lines in Michigan of 400,000 lines. Communities have to submit final distribution system inventory plans in October. So they have been doing work under Michigan's lead and copper rule over the past 4 years to really zero in on their distribution system and understand better the proportion of lead. So in October, we'll have a much better idea, and I'm hopeful that unknown number will be much lower, and some of those will end up in the known lead and some of those will end up in the non-lead. But if you take that 400,000 lead service lines estimates and you multiply it by $10,000 a line, that gets you to $4 billion in need just for the lead service line portion of projects, which is significant. Not leaving that point for too long. What I mentioned, that's just for the lead service line portion of the projects. Just a quick reminder on some of the things that we do have in the budget, which obviously does not plug all of those large holes that I just described to the committee. A lot of the projects we see coming in from communities have lead service lines as a portion of the project, and that's because they're doing the construction right. They're going in, they're replacing a water main, and they're replacing the lead service lines at the same time. So that those federal dollars I was just talking to you about for lead service lines specifically, they can't fund anything else. And what we're really worried about is we're going to run out of loan dollars for the pump stations, for the water main portion, and we're going to walk up to a community and say, hey, here's $2 million in lead service line funding for your $10 million project. They say no, right? They're not going to take that deal because it doesn't get them where they need to go. And then suddenly we're running the risk of leaving federal dollars on the table and not being able to get them out the door. That's the reason for that one-time investment, that ongoing investment that we're proposing. It's not a match in the same way that we say, hey, to pull down $250 million in federal funding, we need $30 million because EPA said that's what we have to do. This is us trying to respond to a community need and not have to come back to this committee next year and explain to you why we weren't able to get federal dollars out the door. We're trying to flag that on the front end. We have the increase that we're expecting in those bill dollars because they've been ticking up each year. And then obviously the green infrastructure funding. Paul mentioned stormwater management. Was one of the things we were able to start offering financing for because of the SRF changes that the legislature enabled us to make. One thing that we've seen is many communities don't have a dedicated funding source for stormwater infrastructure projects. So they're pretty reluctant to take our loan dollars for those. They don't have a way to pay those back. So again, trying to respond to that community need, find a way to supplement the state program for stormwater management through financing with a little bit of grant dollars to make those more attractive, because we did have communities turn back some of our stormwater financing last year. All right, and with that, I believe we're done and ready to take some questions.
So I have a relatively quick question about when the department anticipates it will distribute reporting forms for communities to be able to respond to the October requirement to inventory lead and copper lines.
I might have to get back to you a little bit more specific. So we had the preliminary inventory, which was due in 2021. Since then, and very quickly after that, the department created a lot of information, forums, best practices around how to do the complete distribution systems material inventory. So I think my answer to the question is what the department is doing on that is already out there and available to communities. I don't know that there's a specific form that says, here's our number, and we're waiting to give that out. I think we've given all of that instruction and those forms out because it's a long process. I mean, it involves going out, hydrovacing right at the curb stop, looking at the community side of the line, looking at the homeowner side of the line, checking those materials and seeing, is that lead, is it copper, is it galvanized, what is it?
So we can say to communities who are inquiring that if they've already done all of the background work, that they should be in compliance with the data that is needed for October.
Probably the best thing I can
October
do
deadline.
is just follow up with the committee and say, this is what's expected to be submitted to the department, and here are the resources to make sure your communities know exactly what they have to do.
Great. Well, thank you. We'll look forward to that information. Any questions? Majority Vice Chair.
Thank you.
Representative McKinney.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you guys for being here today. Just along the same line as lead service lines, you guys touched on saying, I wrote it down, 300,000 known likely or likely lead service lines we have, and then 300,000 more that are unknown. 100,000 of those 300,000 unknown could likely be lead, and so potentially 400,000 lead service lines with a $4 billion price tag to replace. I think we touched on it last year, but clarify for me, are these the main service lines or are these all the service lines in the state?
So if you can think of a water system, a lot of times what you have is you have a water main running down a street, right? And then you have the service lines are what run from that main into the home. So we're talking about the entire universe. That 400,000 estimate is all of those residential lines across the state. And you're not likely to see other parts of a water system composed of lead. It was really used in the service lines primarily.
Gotcha. No, thank you for that. And then as a follow-up, that's a lot that we have to figure out and fund and try to get those replaced. Yeah. I know you guys suggesting, $35 million one time this year, but what should be the funding level to try to knock this knock these lead service lines out the park and like get them out and replaced, because our communities are suffering. And then have you guys been doing the testing across the state? Like what, I would love to get those numbers, and if you could share with the committee as well, kind of like what are the hot spots, like because I'm sure it's all across the state.
Yeah, if you, I'll just throw it out to the committee right now. We can put in a follow-up email too, but michigan.gov/MI-leadsafe, MI-leadsafe. You can go to drinking water and you can look up the latest compliance sampling data for every water system in the state. That's all. It's all right there. So you can sort by county. You can sort by community. It's water system chemistry can be complicated, right? In terms of what leads to an action level exceedance. Whether it's you need to optimize your corrosion control, the composition of the system, the interior plumbing in someone's home or in a building that can have some lead content too. So that information's all out there. To come back to the first part of your question, I'm going to just first, before I answer, I'm going to remind your representative of that four-way Venn diagram I showed you. I think there's a policy call to be made at some point in the state about, is the state funding and financing all of this work? Do we need to do something more at the community level? A couple things I think are important. So supplies are on a 20-year clock in Michigan under our lead and copper rule to replace all their lead service lines. They've got to do 5% a year over 20 years. So if you take that 400,000 number, that gets you 20,000 lines a year at $10,000 a line. So that looks like a need of $200 million a year for the lead service line portion of those projects. Another factor in that is EPA has their lead and copper rule that they're proposing, which wouldn't kick in until 2027 and then starts a 10-year clock. So that means 2037 is when all supplies have to have theirs removed. That's not a final rule yet. They put it out for comment. They'll probably finalize it, I think, maybe later this year. But that would have all lines out by 2037. Which is about a 4-year acceleration on Michigan's lead and copper rule. So if you play it out from where we're at right now, that makes it more of like a $285 million a year need. So I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you. I don't have the answer. I'm just giving you a sense of maybe some of the ways you can think through it.
Yeah, no, thank you so much.
So given time, thank you so much for your wonderful testimony, laying out the big picture. I think we saw that very clearly, that there are some significant challenges ahead for Michigan. We're going to pivot now to Kelly Carl, who is joining us remotely via Zoom from the Southeast Michigan Community of Governments, Council of Governments, excuse me.
That's okay.
All those acronyms.
Thank you, Representative Hood. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we hear you well.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm going to share my screen and just double check that I got my technology correct. Can you see my slide?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, let me just get going here. So thanks again for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today on water infrastructure funding. I'm going to focus my messages today primarily on stormwater funding, since others have provided testimony, written or verbal, on both drinking water and wastewater, and kind of covering the gamut of just generally the issues and some priorities for the committee to consider moving forward for appropriations. So just a brief background on SEMCOG and our role in environment and water infrastructure planning. We are the municipal planning organization for Southeast Michigan. We cover 7 counties and close to 200 communities, but we're also the designated water quality management agency, and we've been bringing our regional partners together for more than 30 years to collaborate on policies and actions that support greater public health and environmental quality. Today, I'm going to highlight some of our region's water infrastructure priorities that are directly supported by the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. I hope that some of these priorities resonate with you as we collaborate on ways to improve our region's water quality, water infrastructure systems, and public health. And at the end, I'll have a couple bookends on drinking water and wastewater as well. So I'd like to mention 2 examples of recent regional planning activities. Last year at this time, our General Assembly adopted a suite of water infrastructure policies and actions. that were prepared and adopted by a task force of about 80 representatives, primarily local government representatives. I invite you to review the policies and actions outlined in this document, mainly because they'll likely resonate with you no matter where you're located across the state. We also have an ongoing Justice 40 task force of communities to seek input on some of our regional planning activities. Both of these task forces have prioritized flooding as one of the major challenges communities are facing. The topic ranked high mainly because of the complexities of multiple jurisdictions having ownership over stormwater collection systems, and the fact that our local agencies do not have a funding mechanism to support stormwater system improvements. Much of the work is completed through grants and partnerships. Furthermore, our water infrastructure investment needs in our region are also growing at a pace that we have not experienced in previous years. A recent analysis that we completed determined that our region alone needs at least $1 billion annually to maintain stormwater infrastructure in good or fair condition. This doesn't even include needed investments to address upsizing for future rainfall. So speaking of future rainfall, the needed investments are really further exacerbated by the trends in more frequent flooding events that we've all experienced. The report you see here on the right summarizes current and future rainfall trends in our region, Southeast Michigan. On the left is an example of those projections from the report. The current typical 10-year event, which is common for storm sewer design, is about 3.3 inches over a 24-hour period. By 2050 or mid-century, that same storm might be over 5 inches, and that's averaged over 6 different models. That's a 57% increase from today. That's also equivalent to the 100-year event of today. Much of our stormwater infrastructure was not designed for the extreme events we are experiencing today, let alone any of these future projections. This means we can expect to experience more flooding into the future. We're not going to build our way out of this. We can't rebuild all the old historic stormwater infrastructure, but we can certainly seek out alternative solutions, and we can prioritize flooding as one of EGLE's #1 priorities for funding. So what are some of the alternatives? As you may know, green infrastructure includes both small-scale techniques like rain gardens, but also includes our large-scale natural areas like wetlands. We need to think of these large-scale nature-based solutions as a part of our stormwater and flooding solutions. This may include expanding existing wetlands that already function for flood control to manage more stormwater and alleviate flooding in a particular area, or it may include constructing new features and redirecting runoff from impervious areas like roads to minimize downstream flooding. The point is that increasing investments in large-scale nature-based solutions is an approach to addressing the flooding challenges, to protecting private property and infrastructure, and minimizing the economic impacts of flooding. Just to touch on, while I can talk about the need for funding, I do want to quickly share the type of work that we are doing that sets our region up and our members, our communities, for implementation. So you recognize how funds can be leveraged across different pots of funding to also support local communities and roads. Thanks to EGLE, SEMCOG has received $1.3 million in 2 separate non-compete grants from EPA to support green infrastructure implementation at the local level. It is a role for our region that we hope you will recognize for the future. We can support local agencies, especially those that have less staff capacity and ability with planning and implementing needed projects. We're currently receiving $700,000 from the Erd Family Foundation to identify locations for large-scale nature-based solutions, but to also prepare green infrastructure concept plans for communities that they can then use to apply for construction funds. Finally, we've applied to Federal Highway for funds to develop a regional resiliency plan. I say this mainly so you recognize the need of collaborating on projects that address stormwater across multiple jurisdictions, including our road system. So I'd like to provide a couple qualitative points about stormwater in the SRF program. I know you've heard a lot recently here from EGLE, but historically less than 1% of the revolving loan program supports stormwater projects. We all agree the main reason for this is because local agencies do not have a dedicated funding source to repay the loans. But in an environment where flooding is becoming more frequent and trends in future rainfall are dramatically increasing, we are requesting EGLE to reevaluate priorities in the Clean Water SRF program. The recent SRF legislative updates that were mentioned earlier included intentional language change from stormwater treatment to stormwater management in reference to eligible projects. This means that rather than focusing on the small storms with water quality focus, now flooding is an eligible project and is consistent with EPR SRF guidelines. We also ask that SRF scoring give priority to projects that address flooding. Finally, an option to consider is a dedicated stormwater management grant program or principal forgiveness set aside. As I've mentioned, we have historically underinvested in stormwater projects. Say a set aside allocation of say 20% could help kickstart stormwater management as communities are then hopefully moving forward to seek to develop stormwater utilities. So with or without dedicated stormwater set aside in the SRF program, the Stormwater Utility Management Act on the Senate side is a formal approach to planning, funding, and managing stormwater infrastructure. It would operate like an electric, water, or sewer utility. As it relates to EGLE appropriations, a stormwater utility will enable communities to pay back loans from SRF for stormwater projects. The need for this bill has never been more important. As we've mentioned, stormwater infrastructure has no rate base or local funding mechanism like typical drinking water and wastewater systems. Stormwater projects are often paid for out of general funds or grants. There are close to 3,000 stormwater utilities across the United States in 42 states plus Washington, D.C. The legislation currently on the Senate side does not require any funding from the state, and it wouldn't create a mandate for locals to develop stormwater utilities. Rather, it simply enables those local agencies to institute a critical funding mechanism to address our most pressing water infrastructure challenges. So how does the Michigan Infrastructure Council fit into this discussion? The work of the MIC, WAMC, and TAMC is critical to supporting our infrastructure investments across water, sewer, and storm. Strengthening infrastructure coordination across public and private utilities will lead to fewer disruptions to the public. It will leverage multiple sources of funding, and it will lead to significant cost savings in needed improvements. EGLE can help maximize the impact of these opportunities by providing incentives for infrastructure agencies to align projects across sectors. For example, if a water infrastructure owner coordinates with a road agency during a road project, EGLE can make available grant funds to help support those construction efforts. Additionally, EGLE could expedite permit reviews in order to align with some of the transportation project timelines. Continued asset management funding like the SAW program will only strengthen infrastructure coordination opportunities in long-term investments. So as I wrap up, I'd like to touch on a couple of other topics. One is a drinking water source water protection program. Since the mid-2000s, SEMCOG has been helping to support 12 local communities and the Great Lakes Water Authority along the Huron to Erie corridor with a collaborative drinking water monitoring program. This voluntary, not regulatory program includes actual monitors at the drinking water intakes of the treatment plants in the region that provide drinking water to almost half the state's population. In other words, this is an early warning system. However, most of the funding programs exclude this type of activity because equipment and maintenance are often not eligible. However, if you recognize that the 80-mile Huron to Erie corridor not only has industry on both sides of the international border, but also supports significant freight movement, over 20 million tons in 2019 alone, valued at over 1.6 billion, you quickly might recognize the value of an early warning drinking water monitoring program. This corridor also has multiple pipelines that cross between Canada and the United States. The early warning allows any treatment plant operator to quickly shut down the drinking water intakes if there is a change in the water conditions entering that plant due to something like a spill or discharge. The cost of the program is very small considering the value it provides to protecting public health and the infrastructure within the treatment plants. SEMCOG has been working to seek out funding over the last decade to continue ongoing equipment maintenance and upgrades, in addition to real-time web-based monitoring. Many of the local communities are discouraged at the lack of funds available to operate such a protective system. So we would really look forward to working with EGLE on a mechanism to continue this program that is highly protective of public health and our drinking water infrastructure. The last item I'd like to quickly mention is the proposed statewide sanitary code legislation. While the legislation is still being refined, there are a couple of topics I'd like to mention that could be considered by this committee. And I say this in the context of septic systems being part of our water infrastructure systems. First, there's a significant need to develop a comprehensive database of septic systems across the state. This is somewhat analogous to the SAW program for water infrastructure. Many of the records for septic systems, not unlike our water infrastructure systems, are on paper and in file drawers. In order to successfully implement any statewide sanitary code, there is first the need to digitize all existing records into a searchable format. Additionally, disposing of septic waste can be a challenge in areas where wastewater treatment plants may not accept septic waste. Let's get ahead of that challenge by evaluating the need and considering a funding mechanism to support those needed upgrades to support a proposed sanitary code. And lastly, as a final wrap up, let me just summarize generally my recommendations for the committee to consider in terms of appropriations. First, we ask that EGLE elevate stormwater projects, especially those that address flooding, to a higher priority within the SRF program. Consider a stormwater grant or principal forgiveness element within that program and integrate large-scale nature-based solutions as an alternative for funding. We certainly appreciate EGLE's support of the proposed stormwater utility legislation to advance stormwater funding for local agencies and offset the loan program challenges. The MIC, Michigan Infrastructure Council, is a key partner in all of this work, bringing together all infrastructure sectors. EGLE can support infrastructure coordination by providing incentives to align projects and expedited permit reviews when needed. The MIC asset management training programs, combined with EGLE's funding for developing asset management programs, directly support local communities. Together, these programs will lead to infrastructure cost savings in the long run. Consider an analogous program to digitize related septic system data into a statewide database. Also consider a specific source water protection monitoring program for funding. EGLE is a key partner in all of our work in water resources and that of our local agencies. We also wanted to extend a thank you to EGLE for including SEMCOG in their statewide EPA GLRI request. The $1.3 million we have received in 2 separate non-compete grants has really supported direct infrastructure implementation. And given the success of these funding programs, we can always consider the regions as a partner to implement local programs and projects. And with that, I thank you for the opportunity to speak with all of you, and we'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I appreciate your presentation. We're running a little bit low on time, so I would like to invite our next speaker up, Cindy Roper from the National Resources Defense Council.
Thank you so much, Chair Hood and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to be here this afternoon to talk about water affordability. Before I get started, I wanted to just acknowledge the People's Water Board Coalition, which has been leading the fight for affordable water for over 2 decades and fighting the water shutoffs, which are well documented in the city of Detroit. I work closely with the People's Water Board Coalition and its coalition partners, and I'm here today with the Natural Resources Defense Council. So it was great to start with the infrastructure side of this equation because the infrastructure investment gaps that we've been discussing this afternoon are really a big part of the overall equation. And the other side of that coin is water affordability, because I know it's a balancing act, and what we do to ensure that people can keep their water on matters. So many Michigan residents are struggling to pay their water bills already. This isn't a new problem, but it is going to be a growing problem. Unaffordable water bills and water shutoffs really became the center of a lot of the conversation during COVID, and a spotlight was shined on that. Many of us who were hearing public health officials say that you needed to wash your hands in order to prevent the spread of the virus were also saying you can't wash your hands if you don't have running water. And the governor stepped up and really passed the nation's only reconnection order in April of 2020 with Executive Order 2020-28. So other states put in moratoriums for water, but they didn't, for water shutoffs, but they did not require reconnections. Also, money was allocated to help people get plumbing in place. These were really important steps, but they did not get at the heart of the problem, which is structurally, how do we make it so that people can afford their water bills? In June of 2020, the Michigan legislature, in a bipartisan fashion, appropriated $25 million with Senate Bill 690. That was the first money ever that had been put forward for water bills in the state of Michigan, and I believe it was the first in the nation. Other states followed suit, but Michigan was ahead of it. And again, with bipartisan support, we got that money out there. And because it was also the first money that was available, 144 water utilities took advantage of that money. And I shared in my testimony, there's a chart that you can look at. And there are about 1,400 public water systems in the state of Michigan. So only about 10% of the water systems applied for and received this money, it was quickly utilized, and you can see on the last page of the spreadsheet that I provided that the money went pretty fast within a few months. So it was good, though, because we finally started getting data. I asked DHHS for this data. I was able to get it onto spreadsheet, and these, again, the lawmakers are no longer here in some instances. The district lines have changed in some instances. The pandemic is over, but the problem of unaffordable water bills has not gone away. So, again, I don't have slides because I look forward to the day where we have more data that I can put into charts to show what's actually going on in really specific ways at the utility level. And of the remaining 90% of utilities that had customers who were behind on their water bills, they might not have known about the funding, or they didn't get their applications in time, or they may have just not decided to apply for the funding. So just to, again, I'll try to be brief here. Michigan's water utilities are not regulated by the Public Service Commission. And so we're not pushing for that. I know there's some in this room who might be concerned that that's what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that if you are regulated by the Public Service Commission, there's a requirement that information be produced that you can look at as to how, what's going on with the water system and the rates and charges and that type of thing. We've been working with the American Water Works Association, People's Water Board Coalition, and Senator Chang for a couple of years now on a water utility data transparency bill, where we can start looking at what is happening with water shutoffs at the utility level and across the state. I just happen to have, pull this together based on the data that was available. We can look at water arrearages. We can look at how much of the water debt is being transferred to tax liens, which then put people's homes at risk. We can also look at rates and charges. We're not trying to set the rates and charges, but we can see that information. And right now, none of that is available unless you work really hard to try to track it down in many instances. So last year, the legislature appropriated $60 million to help pay for water bills. It was the first funding since 2020, that money that was allocated under the CARES Act in the summer of 2020. This was the first money that was put forward to assist with water bills. And that came with $25 million in the January 2023 supplemental, and then again, $35 million that came with the final FY24 budget. So these, again, we want to acknowledge that, really important step, appreciate that the legislature did that, and just also want to note that the difference between water assistance and affordability. Water assistance is short-term money that's available for people who might run into unforeseen circumstances or have a crisis in their life that they need assistance to make their ends meet. Water affordability is structurally changing the way that water bills are paid by customers so that they can afford their water bill. It doesn't help the water utility when they don't get the revenue for people who are not able to pay their bills, when those people have their water shut off. That's not helpful to anyone. So how do we set the bills at an affordable rate so that revenue continues to come in? And so over the past year, Senator Chang has been working with other lawmakers, including Majority Vice Chair McKinney, on a package of bills that would actually tackle this problem and figure out how we can make affordable water bills, establish a fund where we're not coming back to the Appropriations Committee and asking for money every year to make sure that we can keep the water on. And that those stakeholder meetings have included the water utilities, community groups, social service agencies, faith-based groups, environmental groups, and others. And the consensus package of bills is pending. So I won't go into that, but I did put into the packet. I believe you received a summary of all of the bills that have been introduced. And so bottom line is that we strongly urge support of those bills when they reach the floor, or if you're on those committees. But we are requesting for FY 2025 another $60 million in order to ensure that we don't fall off the cliff while we're getting these bills passed. According to public sector consultants, once these bills are enacted, and I'm being very optimistic about that, once those are enacted, they should generate about $63 million, which would effectively replace the $60 million appropriation, the bridge funding, I like to call it, that we need between now and the time those bills are enacted. So with that, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to speak today and for your leadership in protecting the people and places that make Michigan such a special state. Feel free to contact me, and we really need your leadership and support again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Roper. We appreciate your long history working on these issues for the people of the state. And finally, we will have Elin Batanzo join us. She is the president and founder of Safe Water Engineering, and she'll be touching on the hydration station line item. And this is funding for our schools to establish hydration stations within school buildings.
I'm excited to talk this afternoon about funding for Michigan's Filter First bills. My name is Elin Batanzo. I'm the president and founder of Safe Water Engineering, a small consulting firm based in Detroit, and I've been working in the drinking water field for over 20 years. So first of all, I want to thank all of you from the bottom of my heart for passing this landmark legislation that does require filter stations in all of our schools and child cares. Michigan is the first in the nation to ensure safe drinking water for all students in Michigan, and taking this proactive approach to ensuring that every student has access to filtered, lead-free water. And prior to this legislation, we had no requirements for water quality in schools that do not have their own water source. And so filter stations are very effective and very reliable for producing water that has no detectable lead in it. And that is important because we have lead throughout our plumbing. Lead is present in our plumbing even when it is marked lead-free. And even though the definition of lead-free has changed over the years.
Thank you. I thought something was wrong. We have the definition of lead-free plumbing still means that we actually have lead in lead-free plumbing. It is mislabeled. Up through 2013, lead-free plumbing could contain up to 8% lead by weight and be marked lead-free. That was revised in 2014, so now lead-free plumbing can have up to 0.25% lead in it. So new plumbing that's marked lead-free still has lead in it. We also have many other sources of lead that are present throughout our schools. There's lead solder, that was banned in 1988. There's galvanized steel pipes. We rarely have lead service lines in schools, and that's because the hydraulic capacity of schools is large and lead service lines are generally very small diameter pipes. But we do have very old infrastructure like lead-packed valves. In schools, we also have plumbing materials that are not intended for drinking water use. Those do not meet the lead-free criteria. They can have any content of leads whatsoever. We find those in laboratory faucets and hose bibs that our athletic fields generally use for their drinking water when they're out practicing on the football field. So we also sometimes we still have pre-1988 lead-lined water coolers. So we have lead throughout our school plumbing. Many of our water systems provide corrosion control treatment, and that is intended to reduce lead, but our school schedules typically mean that that treatment cannot work as intended. To work well, corrosion control and additive needs to pass through the plumbing materials on a regular basis to build up a protective coating on the inside of those materials. And our school schedules with our weekends off, no water use, week-long breaks, no water use, summer off, no water use. You don't get that regular water use cycle that allows corrosion control protection to build up in our school buildings. So when we tend to test for lead in school water, we tend to find it. So because we have, when lead is in contact with water, lead gets into the water. So we need to address lead in school drinking water because lead is a potent, irreversible neurotoxin with lifelong multi-generational impacts. Our young children are the most vulnerable to lead exposure, so getting this handled in schools and child cares is critical. Lead affects brain development, and children are in school to learn, and we need to address lead in school drinking water because we need to protect the intellectual capacity of the next generation of Michiganders. And so because we have lead in our plumbing, when we test and we chase it, we're not protecting all students from lead in drinking water. And I'll just do this slide really quick. As long as lead remains in plumbing, sampling will continue to reveal lead, and single samples do not indicate the lead exposure risk. I didn't have to go far to get lead data that shows how lead in schools occurs. This is from the Birmingham Public Schools at Beverly Elementary School, where both of my children attended. My daughter Gabby is here today, and you saw her in the previous slide in line for a drink at the only filter station at her school building at that time. But they did sampling at Beverly Elementary. They did 3 rounds, and you can see how the water results changed at each location in each round. So some sites tested low in the beginning, tested high in the middle, and some tested high and then tested low. Lead release in water is sporadic. One particular classroom, the music room, originally had a sample at 6.3 parts per billion. That's over the American Academy of Pediatrics recommended lead action level for schools and child cares of 1 part per billion. So they found 6.3 parts per billion. They resampled and found 140 parts per billion in the music room at my child's school. They replaced that faucet with a brand new faucet that meets lead-free requirements, and that sampled at 3.5 parts per billion, still over the American Academy of Pediatrics lead action level for schools. And so this shows how just replacing the materials and adding new lead isn't solving the problem. So the filter first approach, which we have passed in Michigan and we are ready to implement, provides safe water for every student because it focuses on providing certified lead-reducing water filters for all drinking water that is used in a school building. So every child gets protected. So under the bills, there is a drinking water safety plan for each school where they will identify where they're going to have filter stations, where they're going to keep taps for hand washing and non-potable uses, and what fixtures they're going to take out of service. The bill requires filter installation and maintenance. The filters need to be certified for NSF standard for lead removal and particulate removal. And then there's focus on testing to ensure that the filters are properly installed and operating as intended. In the rare event that they are not working appropriately, there are remediation requirements if that filtered water does detect lead. But the research has shown that filter stations are very reliable at producing water with non-detectable lead. I have been working with the Birmingham School District for many years to work on doing the filter first approach in the school district. So we've had a few missteps over the years and had to go back and backtrack and replace filter stations again, doing it right. And if the laws had been in place at the time, they would have gotten it right the first time. Eagle is currently working on guidance. It's out for public comment on how to implement this, how to select plate locations to install filter stations, how to turn off unfiltered locations. That's out for public comment right now, and they're working hard to get schools the tools that they need to be successful. But to reach this goal of safe water for every student, we need to have funding to install the filter stations at every school so that we can have that ratio of 1 filter station per 100 students and staff at each building. So we did a cost estimate for what it would cost. We completed this cost estimate back in 2021. So we estimated that in the first year of installing the filter stations, it would cost around $104 million. Then the maintenance cost would be another $110 million, but that would be over the next 9 years. The cost estimate covered public schools and child care centers. Since then, the law has been expanded to cover private schools and all child care centers. The legislature has already provided $50 million in funding in previous budget, but we need at least $50 million more to achieve that safe water in every Michigan school and child care. So without the additional funding, we will end up with schools that have these protections and schools that don't. Equity is critical. All schools need to be able to install the filter stations to provide safe water because, as I said, even new plumbing materials contain lead. Schools that are able to move quickly to implement this can, if we don't have adequate funding for everyone, they're going to grab that money first, and those that are not able to mobilize as quickly will not get the money for filter stations. So it is absolutely critical to have enough money for all schools to be able to get filter stations in place. And so just to look at what does that mean, how much are we going to be helping Michigan schools in reducing lead in drinking water? I submitted a FOIA request to Eagle a few years ago for voluntary school sampling data that was collected between 2020 and 2022. And so for those schools that did conduct sampling, 71% of them found samples with greater than 5 parts per billion in the water, and 58% of the schools that conducted sampling found more than 15 parts per billion of lead in the water. So if you extrapolate this to the total number of schools in Michigan, that would mean that around 2,000 Michigan schools might have lead over 15 parts per billion. About 2,400 would have lead over 5 parts per billion, and 3,000 schools might have lead greater than the American Academy of Pediatrics lead action level of 1 part per billion. And so filter stations, we have implemented the filter first approach in the Birmingham School District. When I first got involved in 2017, we had nearly 600 samples with lead over 5 parts per billion. But now we have a filter station with a ratio of 1 to 100 in every school, and every single sample that's been collected from a filter station in Birmingham since they've been installed have non-detectable lead. There's no lead in the drinking water. And so I've worked hard to get this approach started in Birmingham, and I'm so excited to Michigan be the leader in the country. No other state has done this. We are ahead of the game in protecting our students in Michigan. So that additional $50 million is critical to ensure every student in Michigan gets the same access to safe drinking water every day in every school. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Batanzo, for your well-informed presentation. That was a great way of helping us understand the broader maintenance needs over time and some of the complexities around the hydration stations and our public health requirements in the state. We will begin to wrap up. I wanted to point out that there is written testimony from the Great Lakes Water Authority. This is the water utility that serves Southeast Michigan with drinking and wastewater. You'll find that this utility alone has over $300 million in immediate requests. In total, looking at the scope of hydration stations, water affordability crisis, drinking water and wastewater financing, and stormwater, we can see that the Biden infrastructure law and the federal funds that came through for ARPA are not sufficient to meeting our ongoing needs for water infrastructure revenue to finance safe and affordable water and clean water for Michigan and the Great Lakes. Thank you to everyone who provided testimony and helped us to substantiate that point and the significant need that we will need to face as leaders of the state. And with that, I think we are ready to wrap up and adjourn. Our minority vice chair, would you like to sponsor a motion to adjourn? So moved.